Gentlemen, welcome. Today, we have a unique event. Robert De Niro and Al Pacino. Let's start with something simple. What's it like working together again after all these years? Robert smiled, leaning toward the microphone. Elaine, working with Al is like reconnecting with an old friend. You know it's going to be challenging, but at the same time, how do I put it? It's inspiring. He always keeps you on your toes. Bobby's right. There's a kind of magic when we're on set together. It's like jazz, you improvise, but you know your partner's got your back. The audience applauded. Well said. Let's talk about your new joint project. Rumors are swirling that it's going to be something monumental. What can you tell us? Al leaned back in his chair, his voice turning thoughtful. It's a story about two old friends who find themselves on opposite sides of the fence. I don't want to give too much away, but I'll say it's a lot about human relationships, about how time changes us. And, of course, a bit of drama. A bit? Robert raised an eyebrow, his tone playful. Al, you're being too modest. It's going to be explosive, Elaine. People will be crying in the theaters. Sounds thrilling. How do you prepare for such emotional roles? Robert, you're known for your dedication. They say you even lived in a taxi before Taxi Driver. Anything like that this time? Robert rubbed his chin, his expression growing more serious. You know, Elaine, I always try to find the truth in a character. For this film, I spent a lot of time talking to people who've gone through falling outs with loved ones over differences. It's not just acting, it's about understanding why people drift apart. Al nodded, adding, I rely more on intuition. Sometimes you just feel the character, especially if the role hits close to home. In this film, let's just say I know what it's like to be at a crossroads. Elaine moved to the next question, her voice sharpening slightly. That's fascinating. You both have a reputation for speaking your mind, especially on social issues. Robert, you recently spoke out about climate change and government responsibility. Al, you seem more focused on art than public statements. How do you balance your craft with your convictions? The room grew quiet, sensing the conversation gaining weight. Robert glanced at Al, his smile fading slightly. I don't see a contradiction, Elaine, he said, his voice steady but with a hint of tension. Film is art, but it's also a way to speak about what matters. If I see injustice, I can't stay silent. It's my responsibility. Al nodded slowly, but his fingers began tapping the armrest again. I agree we have a voice, he said, choosing his words carefully. But sometimes, Bobby, your passion can overshadow the point. People come to us for stories, not lectures. Lectures? I call it the truth. Al, if that's too much for you, maybe you should ask yourself why. All right, gentlemen, this is an interesting discussion, but let's get back to the film. Tell us about working on your scenes together in this new project. Robert leaned back in his chair, his face impassive, but a slight tension lingered in his eyes. Al forced a smile, but his fingers gripped the armrest tighter. The scenes were tough, Al said, his voice calm but with a hint of restraint. Bobby always gives it his all, and that pushed me to keep up. Yeah, we gave it everything. As always. We'll be back after the break, she said, smiling at the audience, but her eyes followed Robert and Al. What happens in 2 minutes will shock even you. So subscribe, don't switch channels, and we'll be right back. Gentlemen, you've just told us about your new film, and it sounds like something extraordinary, Elaine said. But let's look a bit further. Robert, Al, you've both given us decades of unforgettable roles. Do you have plans for the future? What's next after this project? You know, Elaine, this film, it's special. I poured everything I had into it. And to be honest, I think this will be my last acting project. I'm retiring after this. The audience gasped. Spectators exchanged glances, some covering their mouths, shocked by the announcement. Elaine raised her eyebrows, her smile frozen. Robert, that's a serious statement, she said, trying to mask her surprise. Do you really mean you won't act anymore? Robert nodded, his face serious, though a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. Yes, I feel like I've said everything I wanted to as an actor. It's time to move on, maybe focus on producing, supporting young talent. I don't want to drag it out, like some do. Al, who had been silent until now, suddenly laughed. His laugh was sharp, almost mocking, and it made the room freeze. He turned to Robert, his eyes gleaming with challenge. Retiring? Al said, his voice dripping with irony. Bobby, I didn't think you had it in you for more anyway. You've always been so theatrical. Big statements, loud exits. But, movies aren't about slamming the door on your way out. Robert froze, his face darkening. The audience held their breath, sensing the air in the studio thickening. Elaine tried to intervene, but Robert raised a hand, stopping her. He turned to Al, his gaze cold as steel. What did you say? His voice was quiet, but each word vibrated with tension. You call my decisions theatrical? And what do? Al, play the same roles over and over, hiding behind your charm because you're afraid to take risks? Risks? Are you serious, Bobby? You call your endless rants about politics and justice a risk? You're not an actor lately, you're a soapbox. People are tired of your sermons, but you don't see it because you're too wrapped up in yourself. Gentlemen, let's calm down, she said, her voice trembling with tension. This show is about dialogue. Dialogue? Robert interrupted, his voice growing louder. He doesn't want dialogue, Elaine. He wants me to sit quietly and not interfere with him playing the great Al Pacino. But I won't be silent, Al. If I'm leaving on my terms. On your terms? That's always how it is with you, Bobby. Everything has to be your way. You know what? Go ahead, retire. But don't pretend it's some heroic gesture. You're just tired, and that's okay. No need to make a drama out of it. Tired? You think I'm tired? I fought for every role, every word I've said. And you? You just go with the flow. Al, and you call that art. The audience sat breathless, their eyes darting between the two actors. The tension was so thick it felt like the studio might crack. Elaine, sensing the situation spiraling, tried to shift gears. All right, gentlemen, let's get back to your film, she said, her voice strained but professional. You mentioned the challenging scenes. But Robert suddenly stepped back, his shoulders slumping. He ran a hand over his face, as if trying to rein in his emotions. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but filled with pain. Al, I thought we were friends. I thought you'd understand why I want to walk away. But I guess I was wrong. Al stood, his chest heaving, but the anger in his eyes mixed with something else, perhaps regret. He opened his mouth to respond but stopped, as if the words caught in his throat. The audience waited, sensing this moment could change everything. Robert slowly sat down, his gaze fixed on the floor. Al remained standing, his hands trembling. Elaine, feeling the show was still on edge, decided to give them space. Let's talk about what brings you together, she said softly. Your friendship, your shared history. What have you learned from each other over the years? Robert forced himself to speak. Al taught me that sometimes you have to let go of control. Trust the moment. But I guess I never fully learned that. Al sat down, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. And you, Bobby, taught me you can't be afraid to stand up for what you believe in, even if it pisses everyone off. What Al Pacino does in just a few seconds will make you stand up, so don't switch channels. All right, gentlemen, let's talk about how you see your place in the film industry today, she said, her voice professional but laced with caution. You've both become icons. What advice would you give to young actors just starting out? Robert, still looking weary from their earlier argument, took a deep breath, as if trying to gather himself. His hands rested on the armrests, but his fingers trembled slightly, subtle, but enough for Al, sitting nearby, to notice. Robert began to speak, his voice quiet but sincere. I'd say, be authentic, he said, looking out at the audience, though his eyes seemed unfocused. Don't chase fame. Find stories that matter. And, he paused, his hands suddenly gripping the armrest tighter, his face paling. The audience leaned forward, sensing something was wrong. Al turned his head toward Robert, his brows furrowing. "Bobby?" he asked softly, but Robert didn't respond. His breathing became ragged, and he lurched forward, clutching his chest. The chair creaked under his weight, and a faint groan escaped his lips. The crowd gasped. Elaine dropped her microphone and stood, her eyes wide with panic. "Robert," she cried, but her voice was drowned out by Al Pacino's sudden movement. Al, without a moment's hesitation, leapt from his chair and dropped to his knees in front of Robert. His hands, which had been trembling with anger moments ago, now gently supported his friend by the shoulders. "Bobby, hang in there, you hear me?" Al said, his voice firm but filled with worry. "Hey, someone call the medics. Now." The audience froze, some standing to get a better view of the chaos. Confused operators kept their cameras on the scene, though the director in their earpieces frantically shouted to cut the feed. But Al paid no attention to the pandemonium around him. He held Robert, his palms firmly gripping his shoulders, as if trying to transfer his own strength. "Breathe, Bobby, just breathe," Al repeated, his voice shaking, but his eyes locked on his friend. Robert, his face pale as chalk, gave a weak nod, his hand still clutching his chest. Elaine, snapping out of her shock, rushed to the edge of the stage, shouting to the crew, "Where are the doctors? Call an ambulance." But Al stayed with Robert, his gaze fixed on his face. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're not going out like this, you hear me?" he said, his eyes glistening with tears he fought to hold back. "We're not done arguing, old man." Robert managed a faint smile, his breathing labored, but he mustered. "You always were stubborn." At that moment, medics burst onto the stage, their bags thudding against the floor. Al stepped back, giving them space, but his eyes never left Robert. The medics quickly checked his pulse, fitted an oxygen mask, and began asking questions, but Al stood close, his hands clenched into fists. The audience, still in shock, began to whisper softly. Some prayed, others held hands. Elaine, turning to the crowd, tried to calm them, though her voice trembled. "Please, stay in your seats. We're doing everything we can," she said, but her eyes kept darting to Robert, now being placed on a stretcher. Al followed the medics as they carried Robert off the stage, his steps quick but heavy. In the backstage corridor, where the air smelled of old wood and dust, he stopped, watching the stretcher disappear through the doors. His shoulders slumped, and he ran a hand over his face, as if trying to erase what had just happened. When Al returned to the studio, the audience erupted in applause, not loud, but warm, filled with respect. They had witnessed not just a feud between two legends, but a moment when one rushed to save the other, forgetting all grudges. Elaine, still pale, approached Al and quietly asked, "Are you okay?" Al nodded, but his eyes were distant. "He'll be fine," he said, as if convincing himself. "Bobby's too stubborn to give up." Elaine placed a hand on his shoulder, then turned to the audience. "Friends, we're wrapping up today's show. But I want to say one thing. We just saw that true friendship isn't just about agreement. It's about being there when it matters most." The audience applauded, their eyes brimming with emotion. Al sat back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the floor, but something new stirred in his chest. Hope. He knew Robert would fight, as he always had. And when he recovered, they would talk. Not as actors, not as rivals, but as friends who had walked through fire. Backstage, at the hospital where Robert was taken, the medics reported that his condition was stable. The crisis had passed, but a long road to recovery lay ahead. Though the show had ended and the audience had gone home, a feeling lingered in their hearts that they had witnessed not just drama, but humanity. A small gesture, Al's rush to help, had sparked the beginning of a reconciliation that might change their friendship forever.